Great. I'd like to go over now and talk to Paul Godsafe from Glideboats and talk to him about his boats in a minute. But I just want to say that Paul and I have got some history to deal with. We used to race alongside each other, against each other at Oxford. And then latterly, we've got a chance to try out the prototype to some of his boats. So in some respects, rivals, and in some other respects, we're on the same journey to try and help the coastal community grow. But hi, Paul, good to see you again.
Hi Tim.
What I'd like to do, Paul, is to just go through and just understand a bit about how you got into coastal rowing. You've come up with a boat that is, for me, going to hit more of a mainstream market, and just trying to understand how you got into rowing, where you see your boats fitting in the portfolio of the coastal rowing boats around the market, and then a bit more about the boats themselves, if you can tell us a bit about those, because I've seen some pictures, I've seen them in the flesh recently as well, down on the south coast, being used by the Lymington Club and the community and centre there. Yep. But it's nothing like hearing it from the person who invented them. So yeah, that's a sort of fairly open way of saying, tell us what you can about the Glideboats.
Yeah, well, I think for us, the development of a coastal boat is a kind of a next logical step for us in development boats. We started with the development of a fine sculling boat for inland waters. Our second boat was at the other extreme. It's a portable leisure boat. It's compact and deliberately so to give folks an entry point to rowing that, for locations that fall outside the normal club infrastructure in the UK, for example. And along the way, we got asked a lot whether we could develop something that was more suitable for open coastal waters. And that's what brought me into contact with coastal rowing for the first time, really, and getting familiar with some of the established manufacturers and what they were doing with boats. In terms of development of the design, all of our boats are made using rotor molded plastic, which is somewhat unusual. And it has positives and negatives that do influence the way we approach the design process. So on the positive side, our boats are very durable, which can be extremely helpful in the coastal environment. They're relatively cost effective to manufacture, which again has some benefits in terms of creating an entry point for people into the sport and hopefully making it more accessible. On the downside, there are some limits as to the size of boats we can produce, and the material is a little bit heavier than composite boats, although there is a minimum weight limit for racing boats in coastal arena, which helps us a bit. So the challenge for us in the design process was putting all those factors together and coming up with a design that would work and would be close enough to the full format coastal racing boats that they would function as a training boat, or if clubs were willing to use handicapping systems or use novice classes or whatever, could potentially provide an entry-level boat for racing as well. But at the same time, we wanted a boat that had scope for use just for leisure rowing, as that's something that we've really tried to support throughout the process, designing all our boats, is broadening the base of the pyramid for rowing, so that you're just not limited to relatively expensive composite boats. That we can manufacture our boats relatively easily in greater numbers and just make it more accessible as a sport.
And when you talked about the entry there, are they aimed at children, are they aimed at adults, or what sort of range of weights or sizes of people? So
for our coastal boat, we've upped the weight design weight to around 105 kilos. So what's that, 17 stone? And if I do the math, we could probably convert that into pounds for any US customers, but whatever 17 times 14 is, so we've tried to accommodate as broad a range of rows as we can. And what helps us with the Glide Sailor, our leisure design, and the Glide Tide, our coastal boat, is that with the flatter hull profile, it makes it easy to support a wider range of rows as possible. And we do, as part of the design process, work on things like World Health Organization databases of average weights for ages and so on. So we factor all of that in, and there are extremes that we can't easily meet, but we do try and target our boats so that they are available and accessible for as wide a range of people as possible. And certainly for the Glide Tide, our coastal boat, we've had people from young teenagers to people over 80 rowing it. And from size range from about 5 feet tall up to 6 feet 7, 6 feet 8, and it's possible to do that,
Right.
particularly if you're not in a race environment where you're working at the leading edge of performance. And we do the terms of cockpit sizes and so on, we try and stretch that as much as possible to accommodate as many people as we can, and all that kind of thing. So it is certainly a factor in the way we approach the design.
What about the weight, Paul? Is it comparable with a normal sort of, I guess, a FISA boat, or what sort of weight range are they in?
So, well, the FISA minimum weight limit is 35 kilos. Our hulls are 37 kilos. So almost nobody would tell the difference. They're from an absolute weight perspective. As it happens, weight has a relatively small bearing on performance, particularly boats that weight. So it's not something you're really going to notice, unless you were trying to win by a thickness of a coat of paint. And we've started to get some anecdotal evidence now of people rowing them side by side with some of the more established designs, and performance is really good. They're rowing schools that use our boats. They're finding they can take our boats out in groups with boats from our manufacturers, and they'll work in that kind of group environments too. So that's all reassuring that the performance is good enough, and so you could realistically be in a situation where you could race at novice level. Or on an occasional basis in our boats, if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's good. And what about, you mentioned something interesting there about having a sort of handicap system, and it sounded a bit like there might be the sort of plans to have almost like a club class of boat, so that you can race alongside, a bit like the sailing clubs, I guess, do with their different fleets. Is that something that's a new concept?
Exactly that. And I think, particularly as coastal rowing is still developing as a sport, I'd like to see people finding ways of getting people out and racing rather than using the regulations as a constraint. And then, it's not just our boats, but there are potentially other boats that you could bring into play. And so, events become more of a realistic proposition if you're encouraging people to participate rather than putting barriers in the way. And I think that's part of a more general debate around rowing about, making it more accessible as a sport, rather than treating it more as an exclusive venture for people who are, have got their own equipment or access to expensive equipment. Yeah. But that needs a change of mindset a little bit. But we're starting to see now in various places, people are trying out ways of making the sport more accessible, and to encourage race programs that are much more inclusive. And I absolutely would encourage that. We have a vested interest, I guess, but I think it's part of what we've been trying to do. And so, we're working on providing boats that allow it to happen. And so it's then good to see people taking that on the next stage and say, well, okay, let's make it happen. Let's try and organize these events and see how many people we can get interested.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like with the price point where it is, it feels like we can really open up a sort of, like you said, the bottom end of that pyramid, the sort of mass market. You're almost down into kayak and sub territory if we push right. And then you could also imagine beach centres having these fleets of these available, and people taking them out.
without sort of blowing our own trumpet too much, what I'd say is we're creating the opportunity, and we're doing everything we can encourage that kind of mindset. I think there's also other interesting avenues with things like beach sprints. Nobody's realistically going to want to practice and train in their 8,000-pound carbon fiber racing machine routinely. Whereas, by providing something that's a bit more robust, you can practice your launches and landings, and take some of your more or less experienced rowers out without having a very expensive bill at the end of every session. So again, it's part of that opening the sport out and making it more viable and more affordable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. And what about, can you just take us through the separate models, just rough idea of what each one is and dimensions, if you like?
Okay, so we'll start at the top. The boat we've just launched is the Glide Tide, which is specifically designed for open water coastal rowing. So it's 5 meters long, so a little bit shorter than the maximum limit, but that's a constraint of the manufacturing process. Okay. But it's, in all other aspects, is designed to comply with the FISA regulations for racing. So, and we supply all of our boats ready to row. So the Glide Tide comes complete with a throw stroke tow line. We can supply it with buoyancy compartments. It's got an open stern, self-bailing stern, and it also comes with a slot for a sup fin, so you can tune the fin to suit your requirements. You put in a shallow water fin, for example, if that's part of your requirements. But other than that, it's really designed to replicate the experience you get from any other coastal boat. The second boat in our fleet is called the Glide Solo. That's all of our boats are single seat boats, but the Glide Solo was really designed, going back to the conversation we had just before, I describe it sometimes as a rowable sit-on kayak, in that we were definitely aiming at that market. Say, could we produce a rowing boat that could compete in that market? So if you were looking at a new water sport, rowing was part of that choice, because there didn't seem to be anything really that worked at that price point. And so we've done our best to come up with something that fulfills that requirement. The boat itself is not really designed for open water coastal rowing, but it will work quite happily in sheltered coastal waters, and does so in lots of places all over the world now, but also on lakes and rivers. It has a self-bailing capacity for additional safety, but also has space for storing gear. So we've got people using it for camping trips, short camping trips, for example. Right. I even had one customer who put his folding bike on it and had a long trip all the way down the River Thames with all of his camping gear and his bicycles. So it's designed really as a flexible platform, but it also, being just 4 meters long, it's a really fun boat to row. You can do handbrake turns, for novices, being able to do slalom races and all sorts of fun games. It can be quite an exciting place to learn to row as well. Yeah. And the last boat in our fleet is the Glide One, and that was really designed as to replicate the fine single-seat sculling boat experience. So the way I normally describe it is the part under the water is the same as pretty much any other fine scull. The bit above the water is flared so that if you're less experienced or just a bit nervous as a rower, it feels like you're sitting in the boat rather than on it. Right. But it has all the familiar components that you would find on a fine scull. And so as a training boat, for example, what you learn is directly transferable into a composite boat from one of the other manufacturers. The handling characteristics are much the same, but it's made from more durable material. So it will withstand a good deal of abuse, and so it's quite often used for learn to row courses and that kind of thing.
Right, right. It's great. Paul, thanks for this. Thanks for giving us the background, taking us through the fleet of boats. I have to say that I think this is pretty groundbreaking, the stuff you're doing, and I'm really excited about it and seeing how the potential is across the world, actually, to open up the sport to a whole new genre of people coming through. So thanks for that, and thanks for the interview, and I'll see you on a beach somewhere soon.
You're welcome. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks. Bye.